That evening, in front of hundreds of well-dressed people, amid lights, champagne, and music pulsing at the proper tempo, my daughter-in-law turned back, looked me straight in the face, and said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "You standing here just makes everything look cheaper." No one burst out laughing, no one objected, only eyes sliding away very quickly, as if that humiliation were reasonable, as if a construction worker whose hands had once built this entire neighborhood did not deserve to stand within the frame of the party. And the most painful part was not that sentence, but the moment my son lowered his head in silence, choosing his own comfort over standing with the person who had raised him his entire life. If you have ever been publicly diminished in such a cold way, ever been treated as excess, simply because you did not belong to their glamorous world, leave and tell me where you are listening from. And if you want to continue walking alongside stories where the truth does not need to shout, yet still has the strength to stand upright, I would value a subscription from you. The banquet hall of Stonebridge Country Club glowed like a declaration of status. Crystal chandeliers poured light onto the marble floor, creating reflections that were cool and even. Suits were tailored to the shoulder, long dresses skimmed softly across the floor, and champagne glasses were always full before they had a chance to empty. The music did not guide emotion. It only kept everything moving at the correct speed. People came here to witness a wedding, but also to see where they themselves stood within that order. I parked at the far end of the lot. My old pickup truck was coated in a thin layer of lime dust, the kind of dust that does not disappear just because I have changed clothes. It stood among glossy painted cars like a wrong note. I turned off the engine and sat still for one more beat. Through the windshield, the lawn was cut flat, the stone edges neatly aligned, nothing excessive. I knew exactly where that feeling came from. I had measured, adjusted, and come back to fix misaligned sections so this entire suburb could have the straightness people like to call standard. I stepped down and closed the door gently. The suit I wore was the only one that fit properly, dark in color, not showy. The shoes were polished clean, though they still carried faint scratches from days spent climbing scaffolding. I straightened my tie, not to attract attention, only to stand straight. I was used to standing straight in front of blueprints larger than my body and in front of decisions that did not allow retreat. The doors opened. Cool air flowed out with the scent of orchids. A server smiled, his gaze flicking briefly over the suit and then settling on my calloused hands. I nodded in return. I was not accustomed to handshakes that lasted longer than necessary. In my head, I said my son's name to keep my rhythm. Ethan. Today was his Arimos Day. Inside, people clustered along invisible orbits. Fabric moved softly, and the clinking of glasses sounded like short punctuation marks. I walked slowly, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to observe. I recognized a few faces that had signed contracts on papers I prepared, who had stood beside me during inspections. They dressed differently, spoke differently, but their gestures were familiar. The slight nod before a decision, the glance when evaluating. Madeline stood near the bar. White dress, straight posture, hair neatly set. She turned her head just as I stepped into the light. That look did not pause to understand. It measured and set me aside. No irritation was needed, no open contempt. Just a clean exclusion, the way one lifts an object that does not fit out of a box. She smiled at the person beside her and turned back to the dance floor, where conversations were continuing. I felt the imbalance like a change in air pressure. Not painful, just clear. I had walked onto many job sites in mud-caked boots, among people in white shirts, and I knew this feeling. Back then, I was there to work. Today, I was there for a different reason. I searched for Ethan in the crowd and saw my son in conversation, his face brighter than usual. I stopped. There are moments you should not step into. An acquaintance approached and exchanged a few polite words. I answered just enough. Compliments about the ceremony, the weather, and the venue. I nodded, gave a small smile. From a distance, Madeline glanced over again. This time, her gaze lingered longer, as if to confirm what she had just thought. A very slight frown, then she turned away. I understood the message, even without words. When the champagne was poured, I chose a bottle of water. The bubbles faded quickly. I remembered evenings getting home later than planned, because a wall needed extra reinforcement. I remembered the smell of wet cement, the steady scrape of a trowel. Those things were not present here, but they did not disappear just because they were kept out of frame. Madeline approached. She was not alone. Another person stood slightly to the side, like a quiet endorsement. She stopped in front of me, maintaining a polite distance. Her voice was just loud enough to hear, calibrated to the tone of a request that pretended to be reasonable. "Mr. Hale," she used my last name correctly, "we need to talk." I set the bottle down on a nearby table. I did not ask about what. I had already heard it. She tilted her head, the light catching her cheekbone, revealing a decisiveness that had been practiced. "Tonight," Madeline continued, "is about professional relationships. There are certain exchanges, very specific ones." She paused briefly to choose the word. "I think you would be uncomfortable." I looked straight at her. I did not look for an argument. I had heard sentences like this in other forms. Outside the scope, not appropriate. Later on, I nodded very slightly, acknowledging that I heard. "I'm here for my son," I said, voice low and even. "I'll keep to myself." Her lips pressed together. Patience thinned. She glanced around and caught a few curious looks. That was not part of the plan. She stepped half a pace closer and lowered her voice further, this time without the velvet layer over the words. "Get out," she said. Then, to avoid any misunderstanding, "You don't belong here." The sentence was placed down, heavy enough for nearby tables to hear. A gap opened. The music kept moving, but people slowed. Some turned their heads. Some lowered their glasses. No one laughed. I stood still. My heartbeat is steady. I had stood before harder decisions, before walls that had to be torn down and rebuilt. I looked at Madeline without anger and without pleading. I nodded once, a small and precise gesture. No explanation, no argument. I turned and walked toward the door, back straight. Outside, the lights shifted color. The parking lot came into view, rows of polished surfaces. I opened the pickup door and sat down. I did not start the engine right away. My hand rested on the steering wheel, feeling the familiar wear. In the rearview mirror, the banquet hall was still glowing. I nodded once more, this time to myself. I had not yet touched the back of the chair when I saw them coming toward me. Not rushed, not hurried, each step calibrated so as not to draw attention. Madeline's mother led, posture straight, a smile hanging at the corner of her mouth, the kind reserved for encounters where appearances must be maintained. Her father stood slightly behind, hands folded in front of his stomach. The third, her brother, lagged half a beat, his eyes sweeping the room before settling on me, as if confirming that I truly did not belong here. "Mr. Hale," she said, voice soft, low enough for only the three of us to hear. "May we speak privately for a moment?" I nodded, not out of curiosity. I had already guessed the substance from the way they had arranged themselves. They guided me toward a corner near the code area, where the light was less harsh, and the music no longer pressed into every sentence. It was the kind of corner people choose when they do not want a conversation to be seen, but not secluded enough to be called private. She placed a hand on the edge of the table, fingers tapping lightly once, as if keeping control, marking the boundaries of this exchange. Polite, brief, quiet. "Today has been long," she began, choosing each word like arranging fragile items. "The ceremonial part is over. Tonight, there are still a few activities, focused on connection." Her husband cleared his throat and added, "Professional exchanges. Madeline's colleagues, industry partners." He emphasized the word industry as if it were a door that only opened with the correct access card. The brother nodded and continued in an explanatory tone. Professional talk, compliance, mergers, and deal structures. You understand, right? His eyes flicked over my suit, paused very briefly at my wrist, where there was no expensive watch, then moved away as if he had gathered enough information. I looked at them one by one. No one held my gaze for long. They passed looks among themselves, as though handing off the responsibilities of saying the difficult thing. She tilted her head, the smile still fixed in place. "We just think," she went on, "that you might be uncomfortable." The word uncomfortable was set down so lightly that, if you were not used to hearing it, you might mistake it for concern. There were no heavy words, no direct command. Everything was wrapped in the tissue paper of politeness. I recognized the technique. On job sites, people spoke the same way when they wanted to discard an option. It's not that it's bad, it's just not suitable for the context. "You've already been present for the important part?" her husband said, his voice lower. "What remains are conversations that are very specific." He lingered on the word specific, as if I were the living example of what did not belong in that specificity. The brother glanced toward the dance floor where a few men in suits were laughing, glasses in hand, heads nodding to the music. Relationships that can shape an entire career path. He said shape, with the confidence of someone who had never built anything with his own hands, but believed his words were enough to give form to others. I listened without interrupting. I had stood through meetings where people spent hours saying what they did not want to say directly. The only difference here was the setting, brighter lights, thinner glassware. "We mean nothing else by it," she concluded, her tone softening one more degree. "We simply hope the evening goes smoothly for everyone." Everyone did not include me. I understood that perfectly. I nodded, a familiar gesture from someone who has heard enough to understand. In my head, I fit the pieces together. Connection, professional, uncomfortable. Placed side by side, those three phrases formed a very clear shape. I was the excess in the family picture they wanted to enlarge for others to see. "So what you mean," I said slowly, "is that I should leave." She waved a hand lightly as if I had used a word that was too direct. "Not should. It's just that perhaps you would want to." The way she said it made leaving sound like a voluntary decision, even though every door had already been closed. I looked past their shoulders. On the other side of the room, Madeline was talking with a group of people. She smiled at the right moments, tilted her head just enough, and rested her hand lightly on someone's arm at the exact second emphasis was needed. The gesture was the same way people touch an expensive object to assert ownership. I recognized the rhythm. It was the rhythm of a presentation that had been rehearsed carefully. "We're talking about law," the brother added as if to complete the picture. "New compliance frameworks, major deals, things that require a professional foundation." He stressed the word foundation, not knowing that the only foundation that keeps a building standing is usually underground, where no one looks. The way he used that word made me think of footings. Buried, unnoticed, but if done carelessly, everything above collapses. I had spent my whole life reminding people not to underestimate that part. "You work in construction," her father said, not as an accusation, but like a margin note. "Honorable work, just different." The word different landed like a stamp, pressed squarely onto my forehead before I could speak. Different. Light, but sharp-edged. I wasn't angry. I was clear. They weren't pushing me out because they hated me. They wanted me gone so the frame would look more refined, cleaner, more uniform. I thought about evenings coming home when Ethan was small, clothes dusty, hands tired, mind still calculating how many cubic yards of concrete to pour the next day. I thought about loan papers signed, steady payments lined up neatly in spreadsheets. The very things that sustained those career paths were apparently unfit to appear tonight. "I understand," I said. My voice didn't change. "But I'm here for my son. She tilted her head as if weighing that. Her husband looked down at the floor. The brother let out a short breath, impatience slipping through. "You've done enough," she said, choosing the word enough with care. "The rest is for their generation to handle." That sentence reduced 3 decades of fatherhood to a single footnote. I met her gaze. "I'm not here to handle things for him," I said. "I'm here to stand with him." No one answered right away. The music swelled and fell. A burst of laughter rose from a nearby table and quickly died. I felt patience thinning, like paint being scraped away layer by layer. "We just want to avoid awkward situations," the brother said quietly. "You understand." Awkward for them, not for me. I had stood in mud and shouted on job sites. This was nothing. I rolled the word awkward over in my head. I thought of times I had to tell clients a wall needed to be torn down and rebuilt. No one liked hearing it, but if you didn't say it, the house would crack. "I'll keep to myself," I repeated. "I won't interfere." She looked at me again, longer this time. There was something in her eyes, not pity, not quite irritation, maybe surprise that I didn't fade into a shadow the way they expected. I was used to not leaving just because someone found my presence inconvenient. I gave a very slight smile. "I'm used to holding my position when it's necessary." A brief silence passed. They exchanged one last look, like people who had exhausted every polite option without getting the result they wanted. "Very well," she said, the smile returning. "The decision is yours." I nodded. "Yes, I'm staying." They walked away one by one, dissolving back into the crowd. I remained still for another beat. Inside, there was no surge of emotion, just a line drawn very clearly. I had officially become an obstruction in the picture they were trying to compose. I turned back toward the banquet hall. The lights were still bright. The music kept flowing. In the distance, Madeline was moving toward me. I went back into the banquet hall, like someone stepping into a room where the air pressure had just changed. Nothing loud had happened, but everything was slightly off. The lights still hung where they belonged. The music kept its familiar tempo, and glasses still clinked along the same trajectories. Only the looks had changed. No one stared at me for long. They glanced, then pulled their eyes back as if they had touched something they were not meant to handle. At a few nearby tables, heads leaned closer together than before. Lips moved. A soft laugh slipped out and was swallowed immediately, quick and clean. I did not need to hear the words to understand. On job sites, I had learned I had become the subject simply by the way people went quiet. I stood near the drink station, my hand resting lightly on the edge of the table. The surface was cold. I took one deep breath, just enough to keep my back straight. A man in a gray suit walked past, his eyes flicking over me and stopping at my shoes. He frowned slightly, as if comparing an image that did not match the setting. Then he turned and said something to the person beside him. Both of them laughed very softly. Across the room, Madeline was talking with a group of people. I saw her hand move before I heard the words. She did not need to speak loudly, only enough for those nearby to catch it. "He's just a construction worker," she said, her eyes sliding past me in a way. "No special education. Ethan's father. He's not used to places like this." The word "just" was placed perfectly to shrink an entire lifetime. I saw a few nods of agreement. A woman leaned toward her friend and whispered something. Their eyes came back to me again, this time with curiosity mixed with appraisal. I did not turn away. I did not step closer either. I had stood before review boards where a small shake of the head could erase months of preparation. This feeling was familiar, except today what weighed me was not drawings or numbers, but my origin. Ethan appeared beside me without my noticing. My son stood close enough for me to catch the unfamiliar scent of cologne on his jacket, the smell of a new world, nothing like the small kitchen where we used to eat late dinners together. "Dad," he said quietly, "don't mind it." I turned toward him. Ethan avoided my eyes. He looked toward the dance floor, where Madeline was smiling at someone else. I waited. Some sentences need an extra beat to come out. Try to understand, he added a little faster, as if wanting to finish quickly. Her family, they're used to environments like this. Understand. I rolled the word over. There are things in life you understand. Sudden rain, a delayed job, someone being tired. A father being reduced to a job title does not belong on that list. I understand, I said. I did not raise my voice. I did not smile. I'm just standing here. Ethan nodded, relieved that I was not making a scene. He put a hand on my shoulder for a brief moment, a gesture from when he was younger, then withdrew it quickly. Then he turned away and stepped back into the circle of people waiting for him. I stayed where I was, alone. Isolation does not come from being pushed out. It comes when every path is technically open but leads nowhere. I saw it clearly when a couple walked past me, paused for half a second as if about to greet me, then changed their minds. When a server asked if I needed anything in a polite voice, already looking past me for someone else. When laughter rose at a nearby table just as I stepped closer, it died the moment I stopped. Madeline moved nearer. This time she was not speaking to anyone else. She stopped in front of me, her smile set precisely, her gaze steady. Could you step outside with me for a moment? She said just loud enough. The air in here feels a bit heavy. I looked past her shoulder. Ethan was talking, not looking our way. I nodded, not because of the invitation, but because I wanted to end this sequence of looks in the cleanest way possible. We walked toward the glass doors. Behind us, the banquet hall remained bright, full of voices and laughter. Ahead of me, the door opened to a quieter terrace, softer lights, cooler air. Madeline placed her hand on the handle and turned to look at me. We need to make a few things clear, she said. I followed her outside. The door closed behind us, leaving the party inside, along with every look I had just walked through. The glass door closed behind us with a soft sound, just enough to separate the party from the open air outside. The terrace opened to the cool night wind, uplighting tracing the sharp lines of the stone railing. The city stretched out in the distance, blocks of light stacked like a carefully drafted map. It was quieter here, but not lighter. Madeline walked half a step ahead of me. Her heels struck the stone in a steady, deliberate rhythm. She stopped just before the opening to the railing and turned, accidentally or deliberately, placing herself directly in my path. I slowed. We were close enough now for me to catch the familiar perfume she wore, the kind chosen to linger in other people's memories. You stand here, she said, voice low and firm. Don't come any closer. I stopped, not because of the order, but because I wanted to hear everything she was about to say. Madeline raised her hand and touched my shoulder. The contact wasn't forceful, but it was enough to shift me half a step aside. Clean, precise, the way you adjust an object that's out of place. We need to be clear, she said. Her gaze did not waver. Tonight is not a place for misunderstandings. I looked out at the city. The wind slipped through my collar, carrying a chill. I thought of nights on high scaffolding, winds far stronger than this, when I stayed steady because I knew exactly what I was doing. Clear, I repeated. Madeline's lips curved into a very thin smile. She stepped half a pace closer, closing the gap until she no longer needed to raise her voice for it to cut. You build houses, she said, each word dropped like a verdict, and we build futures. You don't have a place in that. The sentence landed cleanly. No detours, no cover. I felt it strike on two levels at once, my work and my worth. She wasn't just pushing me out of the party. She was pushing me out of the life my son was living. Ethan needs a different foundation, she continued, voice even. The right connections. People who open doors, not carry bricks. I turned back to her. Open doors, I repeated softly. To where? She didn't answer. She looked at me like someone who had already decided. The light from below hardened her face, made it bright and rigid. You should understand your position, she said. A father who knows how to step back as helps his child move forward. The word step back was spoken like advice, but I heard the command beneath it. I thought of all the times I had stepped back to measure correctly, only to move forward and keep building. Stepping back was not the same as disappearing. Ethan appeared at the door. My son stepped outside, breathing a little faster than usual. He looked at us, then down at the stone floor, as if afraid of choosing where to stand. "Madeline," Ethan said, "don't do this." For a brief instant, something flickered in her eyes, like a slip of the hand. Then everything snapped back into place. She turned, took hold of Ethan's arm, and pulled him slightly to the side. A familiar, intimate gesture, but firm enough to position him. "I just want things to be calm," Ethan said quietly. He didn't look at me. "Dad, please understand." "Understand." Again. I looked at Ethan. My son's face was there, but his eyes were somewhere else. I recognized the moment. The silence of a child hurts more than any insult. "You don't have to choose," I said slowly. "I'm not asking you to." Madeline gave a short laugh, joyless. "See?" she said to Ethan, though her eyes stayed on me. "He always thinks he's helping, when he's just making things messier." She turned back to me, her voice lower now, sharper. "You've done enough in your role. The rest, leave to us." I stood straight. The wind picked up. The distant city stayed bright and indifferent. I thought of finished houses, families moving in, quiet key handovers. No one applauds the foundation, but without it, nothing stands. "I'm here to celebrate you," I said to Ethan. "That's all." Madeline tightened her grip on Ethan's arm and pulled him another half step back. The space between my son and me opened clearly. "Enough," she said. Her voice rose one level, enough for the wind to carry it. "You don't get it." She drew in a breath, turned toward the glass doors. Then, like she needed to end everything with an exclamation point, she shouted, her voice echoing across the terrace and through the glass. "Go back to your world. You standing here just makes everything look cheaper." The sound cut through the wind. For a moment I saw shapes inside turn their heads. I looked at Ethan one last time. My son stood there, silent. I didn't say anything more. I nodded once. Not in agreement, but to acknowledge that I had heard enough. I did not leave the party. I only stepped back, exactly as she wanted, moving toward the side wings along the edge of the hall, where foot traffic thinned, near the sound control table and the auxiliary speakers. There the lighting was bent away, no longer shining directly like it did in the main room, just bright enough for people to work, not bright enough to draw attention. This was not a place meant for guests. This was where the backstage people stood, the sound techs, the cable pullers, the ones adjusting speakers, hands accustomed to heavy, silent work. I stood there, back straight, arms at my sides, saying nothing. Not out of shame, but because I was long used to being pushed to the margins this way. The rhythm of the room carried on out front, and here, among people who worked like I did, no one needed to ask who I was, and no one told me to disappear again. I stood there, amid the faint crackle of sound checks and dust still clinging to coiled cables. And memory came back in a different way, not heavy at first, but starting with the words that once made me believe I had done right. The day my wife died, the kitchen held one empty chair and the smell of medicine that had not yet faded. Ethan was still small then, standing in the doorway, gripping my hand tightly and saying in a trembling but determined voice that one day he would take care of me, that I was his hero, that he would never forget what I had done. Those words stayed with me for years, through early mornings thick with fog when I took him along to job sites, letting him sit on the truck bed eating cold bread. Eyes wide as steel frames rose like giant skeletons. He used to ask why I wasn't afraid of heights, why I wasn't tired, and I would just smile and say that when something has to stand firm, you find a way to stand firm. I remembered nights when he fell asleep at the table, me pulling a blanket over his shoulders, him murmuring in his sleep that when he grew up he would buy me a house with a wide porch, that I wouldn't have to work anymore. There were rainy nights when I stood under the awning waiting for his car to come back late listening to wind hammering the tin roof like a steady beat, and when he finally appeared, soaked through, he was still alert enough to say the same familiar line, "Dad, don't worry, I'm fine." Those words once held me upright more than money ever did, more than the sense of security I thought I was building for him. Standing here, I understood that childhood promises do not disappear. They are buried under new expectations, new hierarchies. People learn to protect as they grow older. The most painful thing was not Madeline's words. I was used to being judged by surfaces. The most painful thing was Ethan's silence on the terrace, the way he lowered his head and avoided my eyes, not because he didn't remember, but because he remembered too much and chose not to look. In that moment, I didn't need my son to defend me. I only realized that my place in his story had been pushed back, not by rejection, but by silence held long enough to become a choice. I took a deep breath, the smell of metal and electrical dust drying my throat, and I understood this was a turning point, not where I broke, but where I stopped clinging to the words that once kept me warm. On a job site, there are moments when you step away from the front to check the foundation one last time, quietly, without argument. This was the same. I stood in the wings where no one paid attention, gathered the memories that had carried me for decades, and let them settle into something firmer than nostalgia. Clarity. I did not need to remind Ethan of tonight. Words once spoken, if they have to be demanded back, were never promises to begin with. I needed a few minutes to put everything back into the proper order. Not the order of emotions, those are always loud and impatient, but the order of numbers. Those numbers were not born tonight. They had existed for a long time, quietly, persistently, simply never called by their proper names. I did not think of them as retaliation. I thought of them because, for the first time, my presence had been erased completely. Not just my role as a father, but the sense that everything I had ever done had never truly existed in this life. When a person is written out of their own family story, the only thing left with enough weight to speak is recorded truth. In this country, many children grow up with an unspoken assumption. Money from parents is support, not an obligation to be repaid. No one says it outright, but everyone lives by it as a default setting. When money comes from family, it is called help, backing, being there. Rarely does anyone call it by its real name, alone. That prolonged silence creates a false safe zone, where the recipient believes the money will never be mentioned again, let alone called due. And that is why the moment truth is given, its proper title carries a shock far heavier than any accusation, not because the amount is too large, but because a long-held assumption has just collapsed. I am not someone who gives money with no conditions, not because I want leverage, but because I understand this very clearly. Any money that is not named correctly will eventually become the seed of denial. That was my core decision, made long before any signature ever appeared. The first loan came to Ethan on an evening so ordinary, no one remembers the exact date. He needed money more urgently than expected to cover tuition and living costs. I put two options in front of him: take student loans with high interest and rigid repayment schedules, or borrow from me, 0 interest at the start, with a clearly defined grace period so he could get on his feet before carrying responsibility. He chose the second option. We signed papers, concise, with clear terms. A bank was involved not to decide anything, but to manage the records transparently. To Ethan, the signature was procedural. To me, it was a necessary boundary, so help would not turn into something conveniently forgotten later. Then there was Madeline. She did not borrow because she was short on money at that moment. She borrowed because the path she chose required capital. Education, certifications, professional preparation costs, the kinds of expenses considered mandatory to enter a world polished on the surface. I did not interfere with her choices. I offered the same condition I gave Ethan: a family loan, clear documentation, a bank in the middle to track everything. No secrets, No fine print hidden away, only a quiet belief on the receiving side that family money would never truly be called debt. No one was forced, no one was deceived. People simply preferred not to remember, because remembering meant admitting that what they had was not created entirely on their own, and that truth is harder to swallow than polite praise. The bank, in all of this, did only one thing: administration. They received funds from me, dispersed them on schedule, recorded payments, sent periodic statements. They did not lend. They did not decide who owed whom. The lender was me. Responsibility belonged to the one who signed. I had never called in the debt. For a long time, those accounts were left alone, running exactly as agreed. What I did tonight was not to demand payment. I simply activated the next step in a process that had been written from the beginning, in case everything ever drifted away from its foundation of respect. Only at this point did the question no one had ever asked finally take clear shape: where that money came from. Not from sudden luck, not from a reckless deal. Most of it was built through years of accumulation that few people ever noticed. Life insurance policies I signed when Ethan was still a child. Premiums paid steadily for decades. A suburban parcel of land I bought early, left untouched through market cycles, then sold when the price reached the right point. Savings pulled together from choosing not to replace a car when I could have, not taking long vacations, not moving houses even when circumstances allowed it. Each small decision added up into a larger source. No one ever asked where the money came from because they were used to treating a father's sacrifice as something automatic, always there, never needing explanation. When added together, the number was not small. It accumulated over many years across many categories, many amounts that seemed unrelated. Rounded, the total crossed the line of more than $500,000. It could be slightly less if a few secondary costs were excluded. It could be higher if every incidental expense were counted. I did not need absolute precision to say it out loud. That range alone was enough to shift the air in the room. At a party where people were used to measuring one another by appearance, a sufficiently large number spoken at the right moment was enough to destabilize the unspoken order. I took out my phone in the side wing, where the master of ceremonies was holding a microphone while speaking quickly with the technical crew to check the next segment, finishing a sentence and handing the mic back to a technician. The indicator light was still red. I did not realize the microphone was still live during the adjustment. I only stood nearby and made the call, keeping my voice low but clear, enough for the person beside me to hear. I did not know the sound had not fully cut, nothing loud, nothing piercing, but just enough for my words to slip into the speakers, thin and far clearer than I expected. I said, "I need you to prepare the file to activate the clause. Not today, Monday morning." Someone turned their head. Someone else stopped mid-sentence. "Yes," I continued, not avoiding the looks that were beginning to gather. The combined outstanding balance. Both files, Ethan's and Madeline's. A short pause. Then the voice on the other end answered, loud enough that it was no longer just for me. "Yes, sir, the combined outstanding balance is currently over $500,000. The room stalled. Glasses touched lightly and then stopped completely. A what escaped from somewhere behind me. I repeated. "Over $500,000. Prepare all notices. Send them according to procedure." Madeline rushed forward fast and sharp, her voice breaking through the hall. "What are you doing? What kind of stunt is this? Are you trying to ruin the wedding?" "I'm just making a phone call," I said, turning toward her. A call that would never have needed to exist if I hadn't been reminded tonight that I do not belong in this room. An older man, Ethan's uncle, froze and looked from me to Madeline. "Wait," he said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Are you saying this was a family loan?" I nodded. "I am the lender. The bank only manages the records." The air fractured into small pieces. Some people laughed in disbelief. Some went silent because they understood too well. Madeline stood in the middle of the hall, her face drained of color. "You are humiliating me in front of everyone," she said. "I don't need to do anything," I replied. "The paperwork speaks for itself." "You're making people think I took advantage," she said. "I'm not making anyone think anything," I replied. "The statements speak for themselves." She shook her head, quick and hard. It was not denial of the facts, but the reflex of someone who had just realized that what she always believed was a gift had all along had a different name. "I didn't know I was in debt." The sentence hung in the air like concrete that had not yet set, waiting to see whether it would be left in place or broken apart by what came next. The sound in the hall gradually returned to its former rhythm, but I knew that evening had ended in a different way. No further words were needed. The numbers were now standing under their proper names. The looks had assembled the rest on their own. I left the side wing without looking back, walked down the narrow corridor leading to the parking lot, where the lights were no longer theatrical and no one needed to witness anything. Some things only need to be put back into order and then allowed to run on their own. The rest does not belong to the crowd. It belongs to the night, to the house I built with my own hands, and to the conversation that had not yet happened, but could no longer be avoided. The night received me with a familiar quiet. The drive home held nothing new, yet every turn carried the feeling of having been taken hundreds of times. Over the years, I returned later than planned. I opened the gate, stopped the truck, let the engine fully die before stepping out. Nothing greeted me except insects and the wind moving through the wooden fence I built with my own hands. The house stood there exactly as I had left it, unshowy, unconcerned with recognition. I turned on the living room light, the glow spreading across straight walls and right angles, measured carefully from the first day. I hung up my coat, washed my hands, then sat at the desk. Old habits guided me, even while the residue of the evening still lingered in my head. I opened the laptop, not to look for anything new. A familiar folder appeared. Education Hale, like a room that had been locked for a long time. I did not open the files. I only looked at the list and left it intact. The file names did not need rereading. They were no longer information. They were markers of time already lived. I did not check numbers. I only confirmed one thing. Everything had been put in its proper place long ago. I closed the screen. Tonight did not need more proof. What needed to be said had already been said out there, in a way I had not planned but did not stop. Sometimes the truth finds its own path, as long as no one blocks it. The phone vibrated on the desk, short and sharp. Ethan's name appeared. I looked for a beat, then answered. "Dad," his voice was low and tight, missing its usual certainty. "Madeline, she's panicking. The whole family is talking. I let him finish. I did not interrupt. I did not correct. When his words slowed, I spoke. "Have you gone home yet?" "No," Ethan said. "I don't know what to say to everyone." I looked out the window. The front yard lay in darkness, only the motion light casting enough glow to see the path. "Tonight, you don't need to say anything," I said. "Go home first." There was a pause on the other end. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice rougher now, "I didn't think things would turn out like this." "I know," I replied. Nothing more. Nothing needed. "Madeline's scared," he said. "She thinks you—" "I don't need speculation," I cut in gently. "Some things have to be said directly, not through a crowd." "So what do you want me to do?" Ethan asked. This time the question didn't dodge. I set the phone down on the desk, my fingers resting briefly on the closed laptop. "Tomorrow morning," I said slowly, "you come see me." "Where?" "Here." "Just me?" Ethan asked, almost a whisper. "Yes," I said, "just you." The call ended without another word. I didn't reopen the computer. I stood up and walked a short loop through the house, the way I always do before settling something important. Everything was where it belonged. Nothing needed clearing. Nothing needed preparing. The night settled in. I turned off most of the lights, leaving only enough glow in the study. Tomorrow would come in its own way. Not faster, not slower. And when it did, it would not be for an audience. The meeting in the morning was not for explanations. It was to reset the order between father and son for the first time in many years. Ethan arrived earlier than I expected. It was just past 7, the sunlight still thin, the streaks of brightness not yet etched into the road. I opened the door to find him standing on the porch, hands in his jacket pockets, shoulders slightly slumped, like someone who hadn't slept. He didn't greet me the usual way. He just nodded and stepped inside. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table. No coffee, no preamble. I let silence do its work. Ethan looked around the house, the familiar worn details, the dark wooden cabinet, the small scratch along the table's edge, as if noticing their existence for the first time. "Dad," he began, his voice rough. "I don't know. Last night?" "Sit," I said, not raising my voice. "Listen all the way through." I placed a thin stack of papers in front of him. No staples, no highlights. Not to prove anything, just to put the truth on the table. Ethan skimmed at first, distracted, then slowed. His eyes stopped on lines that carried familiar names with unfamiliar meaning. Tuition, living expenses, deposits, year after year. "Dad, you paid all of it?" he asked, like he was asking the wrong person. "I covered it," I said, "from the start." He swallowed hard. I thought it was scholarships, and then—" "You thought," I repeated quietly, "because you never asked." Ethan lowered his head. I could see his hairline, the spot I used to touch when he had a fever. I didn't rush the next words. I waited for the first wave to pass. "I didn't take breaks," I said evenly. "Not one season, not one year. I chose distant shifts, out-of-town jobs, coming home late. I kept the old truck because it still ran. I left the roof alone because it didn't leak yet. I tightened everything so you could walk straight." He looked up, eyes red. "I didn't know you did that much." "You didn't need to," I said. "I didn't do it to be told." I pushed my chair back, stood, opened a drawer, and took out an old photo. Ethan on the truck bed, oversized jacket, both hands holding cold bread. He looked at it and smiled thinly, a smile that flickered and disappeared. "Do you remember what you said back then?" I asked. He stayed quiet. I didn't need the answer. I remembered. "You said I was your hero," I said, setting the photo down. "You said you wouldn't forget." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, his gaze had changed, pulled toward something he couldn't avoid. "Dad," he said softly, I never thought—" "Last night," I cut in, not sharp. "When they said I made everything look cheaper, you stayed silent." He leaned forward. "I just wanted things to stay calm." "Calm for who?" I asked. "For the party. For the image, not for the man who raised you." Ethan exhaled hard. I was stuck. "I understand stuck," I said. I stood between an empty kitchen and a stack of bills. I was stuck for years. But I didn't stay quiet in the face of what was wrong. He trembled. "I'm sorry." I nodded once. Sorry is the first step, but it's not enough. I returned to the table and set my phone down, screen face down. "I don't need you to take my side in front of a crowd," I said. "I need you to stand right when it's just 2 people left." Ethan nodded, tears spilling before he wiped them away. "I let them talk about you like that." "I didn't break because of their words," I said. "I broke because you were silent." The sentence landed without force. Ethan bit his lip. "I'll talk to Madeline." "Not today," I said. "Today you listen." I opened the laptop, didn't open a file, just the folder. I let him see the order, years, months, categories, without details. "This isn't a weapon," I said. "It's a foundation." Ethan sat straighter. "What do you want me to do?" "Take responsibility," I said, "and learn not to stay silent." My phone vibrated lightly, face down so the name didn't show. It vibrated again. I didn't touch it. Ethan glanced at it, recognizing the urgency in the rhythm. "Last night," he said slowly, "someone was recording. I looked straight at him. On the terrace? He nodded. The clip is spreading. They cut it to that one line. Which line? I asked. Ethan closed his eyes. The one where they said you make everything look cheaper. I took a deep breath, not from surprise, from knowing this moment would come. Listen carefully, I said. That clip doesn't define me. It defines them, and it will test you. Ethan stood up. I'll... Sit, I said. You don't chase fire with bare hands. He sat back down. I placed my hand on the table. The space between us measured and deliberate. I don't need you to explain today, I said. I need you to remember who built the ground you're standing on. Outside the window, the sunlight had grown strong enough to draw clean lines across the floor. Ethan took a long breath. I remember, he said. This time his voice didn't shake. I nodded. Good. The phone vibrated a third time. I picked it up and saw a notification flash and disappear. Unread message. Share alert. A link. I set the phone down. This conversation isn't finished, I said, but the next part won't be just between us. Ethan followed my gaze. The clip is spreading, I said, and it's going to force everything into the light. The terrace clip began appearing across group chats, a shortcut clear audio, dragging the truth out of a quiet kitchen and straight into a place where no one could pretend not to see it anymore. I did not need to see the post to know how it would read. These things never explode as official news. They spread the familiar way of this era, a longer than usual post, language carefully polished, emotions placed just right so the reader is guided to the writer's side from the opening line. Madeline posted it at midday during the lunch break, when phones sit on desks more than in pockets. She called it financial manipulation, a phrase heavy enough to plant suspicion, vague enough to avoid immediate proof. The post opened from the position of a victim, emphasizing family pressure, the power of elders, invisible control. She did not name me directly. She did not need to. Everyone understood. Ethan called me as soon as it appeared. Dad, she posted. Naturally, I said. When people lose control of the order, they tend to call it manipulation. The post continued with carefully selected details. The money, the timing, the feeling of being cornered. She avoided mentioning signatures, avoided the terms, avoided the fact that the bank merely administered the records. Those gaps were filled with emotion, and emotion, when paced correctly, always finds people willing to share it. But Madeline made a mistake common to those who work too closely with image. She tagged the wrong role, not the wrong person, the wrong function. She tagged someone who had been present that evening, a banker acquainted with the family, who had stood near the side wing when the microphone picked up sound. She thought he was only a social contact. She did not know he was also someone who had read the files from the beginning, understood the structure correctly, and was accustomed to things being called by their proper names. The response did not come immediately. It appeared as a short, neutral comment without emotion. I cannot confirm this wording. The documents indicate this is a family loan, administered by a bank, with signed agreements. One line, no more, no less. Enough to make the post tilt slightly. Then came the second response. A family physician, a longtime friend of the Hale family, tagged because he had once signed a medical clearance in a different context. He did not discuss money. He simply wrote, I did not observe coercion in my interactions. The exchanges appeared voluntary. Careful readers began scrolling to the comments. The rhythm of the post changed. The third appeared later, but carried more weight. A lawyer who had witnessed the original file set up. No argument, no attack, just a principle. Allegations of financial manipulation are serious. They must be assessed against documentation and context. Naming them before verification can carry legal consequences. The post was not deleted. Madeline edited a sentence, then added a paragraph. But with each edit, the cracks showed more clearly. Those who initially sympathized began asking questions. Those who had stayed silent began reading more closely. That afternoon, a short email arrived in Ethan's inbox. No sensational subject line, no accusation, just a notice from the recruitment department of a law firm where Madeline was awaiting a formal offer. We are pausing next steps to conduct further review regarding a recent public post. Not canceled, not concluded, just paused. Ethan read the email twice. "Dad," he said, "they didn't say right or wrong. They just stopped." "That's right," I replied. "In serious places, people don't pass judgment without sufficient facts. Messages spread faster than the post itself. Screenshots, shared comments." The phrase financial manipulation circled back to the person who had written it, this time accompanied by a question mark. Madeline called Ethan that evening. Her voice was rushed, higher than usual. She spoke of misunderstandings, of pressure, of things going too far. Then, as a calculated retreat, she brought up an old idea in a new tone. Maybe we should do it properly again. Ethan stayed silent. He looked at me. I gave no signal. No shake of the head. No nod. "Remarry," Madeline continued, as if it were a final lifeline. "A small ceremony, private, to close things out." Ethan did not answer immediately. He ended the call with a short sentence. "Let me think." When he set the phone down, the room went quiet. I stood and drew the curtain. Outside, the streetlights came on one by one, steady, indifferent to who was right or wrong. "Dad," Ethan said behind me, "she wants to remarry." I turned back. "What do you want?" He did not answer right away. The question hung in the room, the way the midday post had hung on screens, waiting for the other person to choose how to move forward. The idea of remarrying was offered as an exit, but it opened another door instead, one where everything would have to be named in public once again. I opened the box and took out exactly one folder, placed it in front of Ethan, not inviting anyone to look, letting those around see for themselves. Some things do not need ceremony to be resolved, only a place crowded enough for the truth to stand upright. On Sunday morning, before the regular service, I brought documents with names redacted, not to plead a case, but to place them in the proper space, where every word must slow down and every silence carries weight. I confirm my role as an American English translation specialist, focused on revenge stories for an American audience, and I will translate faithfully without adding or omitting, presented as a single paragraph with no line breaks. The church opened early. Morning light slanted through stained glass, dividing the stone floor into calm bands of deep blue and red. I arrived alone, parked in the outer row, and carried a light brown banker box. The box was not heavy, but solid enough to hold things that needed to stand upright. On the lid, I taped a white label. No names, no big numbers, just one clean line. Files. The church steps were not a stage. They were a place people passed through, paused, greeted one another, and went inside. I set the box down by a stone column and waited. No calls, no messages. People arriving slowed when they saw me, recognizing the face from the clip a few days earlier. Some looks were curious. Some nods were brief. I did not answer with words, only held my position. Ethan arrived a few minutes after me. He wore a simple shirt, no tie. When he saw the box, he stopped, took a deep breath, then stepped up onto the steps beside me. The distance between father and son was close enough that we did not need to lower our voices. "Are you ready?" I asked. He nodded without hesitation. Madeline appeared later with a few relatives. When she saw me in the box placed openly, her steps slowed. She meant to go straight inside, but the eyes around her held her in place. The steps were more crowded than usual today, not loud, but with enough people that silence carried weight. I opened the box. No papers flew out. No thick stacks were displayed. I only placed a few redacted folders on the edge. Private lines covered, structure, signatures, and timelines intact. I laid them out neatly, the way blueprints are placed before a homeowner. No explanations. Let the shape of the truth speak. An acquaintance stepped closer and asked quietly, "What are you planning?" "I'm planning nothing," I said. "I'm only bringing what already exists." Ethan stepped up half a step. His voice was not loud, but clear, enough for those nearby to hear. "I want to say one thing," he began, looking at no one in particular. "My tuition was not a scholarship. My father covered it from the beginning. There are documents. There is bank administration. No one was forced." A pause fell, no murmuring, no laughter, only a slight shifting as those nearby leaned to see the redacted folders more clearly. Ethan continued, steadier now. "On the terrace, when they said my father made everything look cheaper, I stayed silent. That was my fault." He turned to me, then back to the small crowd. "Today I am standing here to say what is right." Madeline stepped forward, her face pale. "What are you doing?" she said, loud enough for a few to hear. "This is not the place." "Precisely because it is this place," Ethan interrupted, calm. "It needs to be said clearly." I did not step in. I gently slid one folder forward, revealing the form of a signature with names covered but format intact. No highlighted numbers, no bold print, just enough structure for those who understand to understand. An older person asked, "Is there confirmation?" "I can confirm," another voice said from the left. The banker who had been tagged by mistake stepped forward. No suit, just a shirt. "I've read the files. The bank's role is administrative." No one clapped. No one argued. Madeline looked around for a path other than the church doors. There was none. "You are humiliating me," she said, her voice breaking. "In front of everyone." "I did not name anyone," I said, speaking for the first time. "I only placed the papers where they belong." A woman whispered, "Paperwork tells the truth." Madeline shook her head, hands trembling. I didn't know." "Not knowing does not mean it did not exist," I said evenly. "It only means you did not want to remember." A man stepped onto the steps and introduced himself briefly, Madeline's lawyer. He looked at the folders, then at Ethan, then at me, his caution undisguised. "I recommend," he said audible, "that any public allegations be withdrawn to avoid unnecessary legal consequences." The crowd shifted slightly, not from victory or defeat, but because the balance had changed. Madeline turned to the lawyer, whispering urgently. He shook his head very slightly. I closed the box and latched it. No more papers, no more words. Ethan stood beside me, shoulders straight. "Dad," he said quietly. I nodded. "That's enough." The church bell rang, signaling the service was about to begin. People started moving inside. The steps returned to their familiar flow, but not as before. Madeline remained standing between two steps, facing eyes that no longer looked away. The lawyer stepped closer to her, voice lowered but firm. "If the allegations are not withdrawn today, we will have to advise our client to consider the next risks." Everything did not end with a declaration of victory or defeat. It ended with small adjustments, made in the right places and sustained, like repairing a structure once the crack has been found. The following week, the calls became shorter, cooler, stripped of emotion. No new posts, no long comments, only paperwork moving along its prescribed path. The loan was restructured in the true sense of the word, the repayment schedule extended, the interest rate kept as originally agreed, the responsibilities of each party clarified in plain terms. No one was cornered, and no one could claim they didn't know anymore. The bank continued its role as administrator, cold and consistent. Everything was re-signed in a small conference room under white lights. No unnecessary witnesses. When the pen was set down for the last time, ambiguity left the table. Madeline's career shifted onto a different track, not loudly, not in collapse. The offer that had been paused did not return. Instead came a position at a smaller firm, less glamour, longer hours. She learned to speak less online and write more in internal files. The looks around her no longer propped her up, but they no longer interrogated her either. It was the kind of change no one congratulates, one that simply forces adaptation. Ethan simplified his life. He sold the expensive car and switched to an older model, downsized his apartment, closer to work. For the first time in years, he built a budget by hand, line by line. Not out of lack, but to see where the money actually went. His dinners involved fewer parties and more meals cooked at home. He called me more often, not to ask for anything, but to talk. His voice grew less rushed, his words less defensive. When he visited job sites, he stood quietly, observed, asked questions at the right moments, like someone beginning to understand how much the part underground matters. As for me, I expanded the construction company the same way I always had. No big signage, no loud promises. One new contract in the suburbs, a larger crew, a small shop upgraded. I invested in equipment, training, safety schedules. The work grew steadily, without spikes. I liked this rhythm. It let me come home on time more often, eat dinner slower, sleep deeper. The things once dismissed as making everything look cheaper returned to their proper value, durable, real, and sufficient. Family gatherings became rarer. When they happened, there were no arguments. People talked about the weather, traffic, things that did not require taking sides. I did not seek to be liked. I only held my position. And a position, when not fought for, becomes clear on its own. One late afternoon, Ethan stopped by the shop. He waited while I finished the final inspection of the day. When we sat down on the concrete step, he took a deep breath and spoke like someone who had prepared carefully. "Dad," he began, "Madeline wants to meet." I looked toward the row of houses rising into frame. "What do you want?" I asked. He stayed silent for a few seconds. "I don't know yet," I nodded. "Then don't rush." His phone vibrated, a short message. He read it, and his expression changed. Not panicked, just stilled, like someone seeing a new variable appear on a drawing. "Dad," he said slowly, "she's pregnant." The sounds of the site continued behind us. Hammers striking, machines running, uninterrupted by the news. I stood, brushed dust from my hands, and looked at Ethan. No questions, no judgment, just a pause long enough to understand that the order we had just reset would now face another test. A new life had entered the picture, forcing the adults to decide what kind of foundation they would build, this time not just for themselves. The morning at the job site comes early. The sun is still low, wind moving along newly raised steel frames, carrying the smell of fresh lumber and damp concrete. I stand watching the crew start the day, each person taking position, each familiar motion repeated with a care that has become habit. Here there is no room for display. Everything exists because it bears load, well, because it is set correctly. I think about foundations. No one praises what lies underground. People only notice the roof when it is finished. But if the foundation is wrong, everything above it will eventually crack. Character is the same. It does not need an introduction or spotlights. It only needs to stand when tested. Ethan arrives later, unannounced. He is dressed simply, holding a hard hat, like someone who has learned to ask permission before stepping into another person's space. We stand side by side, looking at the build. We do not talk much. Some silences, when they last long enough, say everything. "Dad," he says slowly, "I understand why you're not rushing." I nod. Rushing is easy. Being right is hard. He looks down at the leveled ground. "I'll rebuild," he says. No grand promise, just a sentence, set down like the first stone. Madeline does not appear. I do not wait. Forgiveness is not a fast pass, and resentment is not a foundation for anything that lasts. Some boundaries need time to be respected, not words to be waved away. In the afternoon, I sign another small contract, not a leap, just steady growth. The company expands the way I know, more people, more training, stricter safety discipline. The things that seem slow are what let everything go far. I get home earlier, eat dinner on time, sleep deeply. Life contracts back to its proper size. At night, I sit alone on the porch, listening to the wind touch the fence. I do not think about winning against anyone. I think about where I stand. Builders learn this early. No one lives long on the surface if the foundation cannot bear weight. I rest my hand on the wooden table, feeling the grain under my palm, marks of time and labor. Some things do not need repeating. They are there because they were done right. I build houses for others, but dignity is something everyone has to build for themselves. I tell this story not to prove I was right and not to make anyone else wrong. I tell it because some things, if not put back where they belong, quietly erode a family in very polite ways. I have built houses for others my whole life, used to standing behind the lights, used to work no one applauds. Only when I was told I made everything look cheaper did I understand. Some foundations are only noticed when someone tries to deny that they exist. If you're listening this far, maybe you've been like me, doing more than you say, caring more than you ask for, staying silent longer than you should. Maybe you've been looked down on because your work isn't glamorous, because you chose responsibility over image. Or maybe you're standing at a hard choice right now. Stay quiet to be accepted, or speak the truth to keep your dignity. If that's you, and tell me where you're listening from. And if you want to keep walking with me through stories where justice doesn't need to shout, where truth stands on time, paperwork, and character, I'd appreciate a subscription.